Good evening. Hope everyone can hear me. I'd like to welcome you here this evening. It's wonderful to see so many of you here who were able to join us. My name is Kendra Clayton. I'm the president of the Graduate Theological Foundation, and on behalf of the faculty and staff, I'd like to welcome you all. It's lovely to see you. One bit of administrative work before I get on with introductions. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, we'll need to see all of our graduating class. We'd like to ask that you join us upstairs in this building at the top of the Bendix Theater. It's directly across the hall from the Discovery Ballroom where the graduation will be held. So at 9 o'clock, we'll have a rehearsal, and we hope to see you all there. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce to you the Reverend Canon Dr. Robin Gibbons. He's Dean of Studies of Foundation House, Oxford, a longtime faculty member, and a longtime friend of the Foundation. He's here this evening to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Clayton. I stand in awe of the person underneath me here, and you won't. No, I won't either. None of you will at the end of this, because you'll be entertained and informed by what is going to take place. It's my great pleasure on behalf of the Graduate Theological Foundation to welcome one of our distinguished faculty members, who is also the Fellow and John Henry Cardinal Newman Professor of Theology and Ecclesial Mediation, which we all need at the moment, at the Graduate Theological Foundation. He's known as Dr. Bernard J. O'Connor, but we call him Father Bernie, so he's quite happy to be called Father Bernie by any of you, or even other names too. What I'd like to say is that Bernie, for many years, has been involved in academic life and pastoral life, but after 2004 was involved very heavily in the Congregation for the Eastern Churches in the Vatican in Rome, and so has a very inside knowledge of what has happened within the ecclesial community of the Roman Catholic Church in its inner administrative workings, and also is someone who knows the Pope Emeritus quite well. I'm sure that's true to say. He's actually someone who has a personal connection with the Emeritus Pope Benedict. It's a great delight to have you, Bernie, and a great delight for us to have you give the Runcie lecture this year in the 51st series, if you like, of the Foundation's life, but also following a distinguished number of other people who've given it, including myself. I only say that to give a little bit of applause for everybody. Please do listen to him. When he's come to his conclusion, which he assures me will be before 8 o'clock, which is the kind of cut-off period. No, you keep to that one. What we're going to do is, if there is time, there might be time for one or two questions, which I will mediate. If not, please feel free and do connect with him afterwards and really enjoy his insights and theological precision about the workings of a really interesting phenomenon in the ecclesial world, which is the Vatican. And so I introduce you, and your title, The Papal Resignation of 2013, A Pilgrim's Journey to Emmaus.
Thank you very much, Reverend. Thank you very much, Dr. Gibbons. Again, a pleasant good evening to each of you, with appreciation for your being here and for enduring my remarks on this very complex and sensitive subject of the resignation of Pope Benedict and the election of Pope Francis. A little apology, I'm sitting. Normally I would walk and wander and speak very casually, but my legs are involved in conducting their own protest. Obviously against too many marathons and too many Olympic tryouts over the last 30 years, they're getting their revenge. I would say, too, that the text that I'm going to share with you, it's a written text, and I'm reading it, which is not my style, but it will be online, and it will be published later. When you see it, you will notice that there's a weave of quotations from various papal documents, particularly the speeches of Pope Francis since he's been elected, but you would not notice this when I'm addressing the text. So I encourage you, if you're not too bored, to read it online, and then you will see the structure and get a better sense of the reasoning of this quite remarkable successor to the chair of Peter. So how are we going to proceed? First, with some comment about 3 schools of thought which surfaced almost immediately after the announcement of the resignation concerning the kind of successor which the Catholic Church was thought to need. Then I'll make some comment about the resignation itself. Then about what I believe to be elements of the bureaucratic model, if you will, which characterizes the function of the curia, and then what I think are elements of a new model, a model of service, which is becoming quite characteristic of Cardinal Bergoglio, now Pope Francis. So with that in mind, on February 11, 2013, Pope Benedict informed an astonished world of his intention to renounce the papacy, effective on the last day of that month. No such resignation had occurred since 1415. Now we would have a pontiff emeritus in retirement while his legitimately elected successor occupied the Petrine office. Conjecture flourished about whether Pope Benedict may have been somehow coerced into making his historic decision, or whether a more attentive analysis of his pontificate might verify that his action was entirely consistent with his views on responsible leadership. What followed, of course, was widespread anticipation relative to a mid-March conclave. How would the cardinals choose? Speculation covered a range of possible outcomes. Some were prepared for a pope who would merely mirror conventional candidacy, one who would guide the Church to a sort of recovery mode from the aftermath of Pope Benedict's rather shocking departure. Their hope was that the new pope would motivate the Church to affirm her essential doctrine, her manner of reflective, though critical, interaction with secular society, and her inclination to preserve a Eurocentric philosophy based upon papal sovereignty and an administrative style seeped in the attributes of power and of expressly defined lines of authority. In such a scenario, the Roman Curia, for example, the administrative center of Roman Catholicism, with its aggregate of branches, or as they are called, dicasteries, should be expected to visibly adjust. However, despite negative appraisal across the globe, the Curia would likely cling to its professed mode of support for the papacy, though at the same time moderating the tendencies of any new pope to cross the boundaries of established agendas and protocol. While every pope since the beginning of the 20th century has sought to influence the Curia's mandate and functions, evidence indicates that while structures and titles may regularly alter, a conservative and resistant administrative mindset invariably prevails. In theory, the Curia consists of those designated as cooperators with the Pope, but it equally contains those who believe that it is imperative to bring him into alignment with their own ecclesial outlook. Accounts of escalating tensions between popes and their curia abound, and questions habitually surface about who ultimately guides whom, and of the actual extent to which the curia may opt to include or exclude the Pope from its dealings. Careerism and external interference have become widely reported. Think of Paolo Gabrielli, the Pope's butler. A truly rational pope, then, should leave the curia relatively free to perpetuate its well-entrenched approach. While other Vaticanists proposed that the new pope should be a kind of interim, yet someone who would enable the Church to regain lost credibility and who could defend the Church from those insisting that its relevance was a near inevitable decline, irreversible decline. Such a papacy would then allow for a next pontiff to more assertively re-authenticate the message of Catholic identity, heritage, and teaching. Such a need was manifest, especially given the rate at which Europeans, North and South Americans likewise, were defecting from the Church and were either converting to fundamentalist sects or lapsing into casual agnosticism. And because a serious portion of the world deduced that reliance upon God was nothing other than a form of intellectual primitivism, consequently for them, the very notion of church was held to be dubious, if not utterly void of validity. Church edifices and institutions logically emptied, since the church per se was perceived as a lifeless and decrepit anachronism. Surely then the divine Spirit would grant a transitional papacy which would culminate in another, and which in turn would initiate a period of renewal, reunification, and restoration. And ecclesial Lazarus was being called to leave the tomb and so become a witness for the Church as agent of sacred promise and sacred presence. These advocates' perspective combined elements of fear and of the apocalyptic. And then there were those, such as journalist John Allen, who interpreted the post-Benedict conclave as potentially being clearly and self-consciously, quote, the most anti-establishment conclave of the last 150 years, quote. The electors, poised for taking risk, might perceive themselves to be ready for change. That change would not equate with a rejection of Benedict XVI's papacy, but constitute a rejection of the Church's current management and governance. On March 13th, the conclave chose the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Taking the name Francis, the Holy Father is the first South American to become Pope and the first Jesuit, a member of the Society of Jesus, which was founded in the 16th century by the Spaniard Ignatius of Loyola. Rumor circulates that Pope Francis was second in the conclave which elected Pope Benedict in 2005. This opinion cannot be verified, however, owing to the obligation of secrecy which binds the voting cardinals. Still, it is plausible, especially given the fact that a significant majority of Catholics reside in South America. Prior to the 2013 conclave, prominent cardinals, among them Timothy Dolan of New York, publicly spoke in favor of a South American pontiff. They maintained that the time had come for a de-Europeanization of the papacy. A South American, they opined, would symbolize rejuvenation, a breath of fresh air, and a positive response to Catholicism's actual demographics. After all, why should Europe be regarded as a front runner in this conclave? The Church in Europe is in chronic disarray and demise, a mere skeleton of the once vigorous body of believers who had inherited the Roman Empire in antiquity. From the moment when Pope Francis was presented upon the loggia of St. Peter's, people intuited that the cardinals had reliably identified the practical need of the modern church and had been unafraid, as predicted by Allen, to venture into the realm of the uncharted. Pope Francis immediately communicated that he is his own person and is neither indebted to curial interest groups nor fixated upon categories bequeathed by European legacy. Having provided you an introduction which affords some sense of the context for what has lately transpired in terms of the papacy, the remainder of my remarks will elaborate upon three sub-themes. First, what we as a pluralist community of scholars may learn from the resignation of Pope Benedict. Second, observations on the implied bureaucratic model which characterizes the Roman Curia. And third, Pope Francis' model of service and its being his intentional antidote to the bureaucratic paradigm, in addition to being an inspiration for how ordinary Catholics, together with all persons of goodwill, might ground their everyday existence. Pope Benedict's resignation. Note that the term is resignation. You will recall how the media at the time often preferred to speak of the Pope's abdication. But the descriptive abdication was entirely incorrect. This is because monarchs abdicate, and Pope Benedict had strenuously reacted against every vestige of monarchy which had accrued to the papal ministry. Pope Benedict's concept of the papacy was that of a universal shepherd. He saw himself as a brother bishop within the College of Bishops, and he saw himself as a mediator in conformity with the mediatorship of Christ, who was willing to share with the world the Church's patrimony of wisdom, experience, and resources. As had his predecessor, Blessed John Paul II, Pope Benedict embraced Christians of all denominations, adherents of non-Christian faiths, and individuals who denied deity and disdained reason's appeal to religious premises and tenets. Pope Benedict viewed his role as that of a catalyst, urging the Church to embrace dialogue and to facilitate whatever means which would permit mankind to recognize its commonality, tolerance, respect, and solidarity. For him, only consolidated effort might offset the program of unbridled secularism to eradicate God and religion from the core of contemporary civilization. Thus motivated, Pope Benedict also realized the inherent incompatibility of a monarchical papacy with that of the otherwise capacity of the papacy to unify and to promote awareness of the challenges confronting humanity. Not surprisingly, with his election in 2005, Pope Benedict annoyed some critics by his refusal to reinstate the sedia gestatoria, the portable throne, to carry the pontiff during liturgical ceremonies. He would not be carried as if being a man above men, but would walk among his brothers and sisters as did the earthly Jesus. Pope Benedict also eliminated the papal tiara from the papal coat of arms. This was the beehive-like crown, which for centuries was a reminder of papal claims to overlordship in matters spiritual, and within Christendom at least, entitlement to political and social fealty. Pope Benedict replaced the crown with a mitre comparable to what is worn by fellow bishops, you know, the pointed little hat. He thereby emphasized that the Pope was to be a pastor, never a king. And at the onset of his pontificate, Pope Benedict restored the usage of the ancient form of the pallium. The pallium is a band of wool used liturgically and confirmed by the Pope as a symbol of collegiality with metropolitan archbishops. By his return to a very early version of the pallium, Pope Benedict showed that the Church must revert to the simplicity of her origins and liberate herself from extraneous and contradictory accretions. Is there anything in Pope Benedict's idea of the papacy which suggests that his resignation was foreseeable? Yes. For example, since he thought the papacy to be in general continuity with the Church's episcopate, and it is normal for bishops to resign, then why not the resignation of a pope? Indeed, canon law makes provision for the same. Canon 401, paragraph 1, discusses the resignation of bishops, those who have reached their 75th year. Paragraph 2 considers the case of resignation due to decline in health. And similarly, Canon 354 contemplates the resignation of curial cardinals, and Canon 332 defines the resignation of an actual pope. And for the validity of the Pope's resignation, such an act must simply be made freely and duly manifested. Acceptance by anyone is not a formal requirement. So Pope Benedict's declaration to the College of Cardinals on February 11th met the canon's criteria. But the declaration further contains several crucial implications. Among them, Pope Benedict behaved courageously, humbly, and reflectively. Upon examining his conscience before God, he concluded, quote, with certainty, quote, that he lacked the strengths due to an advanced age, as he described it, for an adequate exercise of the Petrine ministry. Doubtless, he remembered the precarious condition of Pope John Paul II, when advanced Parkinson's disease wreaked havoc upon his mind and body. Moreover, in 2010, Pope Benedict gave 2 interviews to journalist Peter Seewald. Seewald raised the issue of possible resignation, and to which the Holy Father responded, quote, "When a pope realizes clearly that he is no longer physically, mentally, and spiritually capable of carrying out his role, then there is legally the possibility and also the obligation to resign." End of quote. And so the later declaration, February 11th, refers to deterioration of strength, to the incapacity to engage today's world, subject to so many rapid changes and shaken by questions of deep relevance for the life of faith, end of quote. A pope then has to be able to meet and to address the demands of a vibrant and alert society. A pope cannot be passive or preside as a titular figurehead. He must be active, vigorous, and participatory within a world which looks to his actions as well as to his words. The declaration also attests to Pope Benedict's humanity, a humanity schooled in realism and in compassion, a humanity shaped by the grace of the gospel. The pontiff stresses the redemptive necessity of suffering, suffering being inseparable from Christian fidelity. The effects of old age and diminished health cannot be ignored, but neither should they be dreaded. For human nature is always blessed and never ceases to be within the scope of the divine will, even where there is frailty and inner turmoil. It therefore behooves each of us, the Pope included, to be transparent, direct, and candid. We are not self-sufficient or absolute in ourselves. We have defects, and for which the Pope says, I beg your pardon. As for Pope Benedict's retirement, commencing on February 28th, the declaration concludes by stating that his will become a life dedicated to prayer. Hence, he will absent himself from all public involvement in church decision-making. There is an obvious lesson. Active ministry is not an excuse to abandon prayer. Sorry, but the dictum, my work is my prayer, is woefully flawed. Rather, our work flows from our prayer, and our prayer infuses our work. Cardinal Sodano expressed to Pope Benedict his confidence that, quote, your mission will continue, quote. Through his prayer, the Emeritus Pontiff will indeed continue his mission as intercessor, his mission as prayerful contributor to the Church's progress and development, his mission of pleading for reconciliation of the world and of the Church to the eternal spirit of creative love. During this period of special vocation to prayer, Pope Benedict will validate St. Augustine's assertion that prayer is the encounter of God's thirst with ours. The Lord of the Church thirsts that we may thirst for him. One can evaluate Pope Benedict's pontificate on diverse levels beyond what has been described. They might include his concern for justice with regard to sex abuse victims, authorship of books on Christology, his attempts to extend diplomatic ties to Russia, Vietnam, and China, his repeated emphasis on the rapport between faith and reason, his critique of capitalism, and his analysis of political ethics. But it is his resignation for which history will most probably remember him. Because of his discernment and his resulting decision, he has made the papacy less aloof and remote, rendering it more accessible for interreligious dialogue. The ecumenical dimension of his resignation thus soon became the subject of non-Catholic attention. On February 17th, Metropolitan Hilarion of the Russian Orthodox Church spoke on Moscow television to a national audience. He paid tribute, for instance, to Pope Benedict's desire to cooperate in various charitable and cultural products. But quite importantly, Hilarion stated, is that the impact of the Pope's resignation is by no means known to leaders, religious or secular. We are left to struggle, left to reassess our presuppositions, and to probe what we think we know and probably do not. Russell D. Moore, a Protestant evangelical, lauded Pope Benedict for having, quote, stood against the nihilism that defines human worth in terms of power and usefulness. Benedict, he says, has stood firmly to point to the human forces the world is seeking to wipe away, end of quote. Well, the Roman curia, a bureaucratic model. As the papacy of Pope Benedict XVI drew to a close, the media debated how a 300-page report prepared by a three-cardinal commission assigned to the task by Pope Benedict may have been the last straw in persuading him that he could no longer cope with the corruption and internal divisiveness which marred his own curia. Cardinals Herrance, De Giorgi, and Tomco submitted data which was purportedly explosive. Mafia attempts to blackmail Vatican officials, homosexual cliques within the curia, and self-destructive influence peddling by prelates. The Pope was said to have reviewed the report, and although he decided to reserve it for his successor, the report's contents became the topic for informational sessions among the cardinals prior to their entering the conclave. Am I of the opinion that the findings of this report led to Pope Benedict's resignation? No. Its pages would contain nothing which would startle the former prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The problem facing the Pope was probably not derived from horrific revelations, but of his not having the strength and energy to apply himself to curial investigation. As stated, if anything brought down the Pope, so to speak, it was the infirmity associated with old age, nothing more. And most probably, the Pope would have also realized that this report did not embody the whole record of curial commitment. Offensive actions by some curial officials do not qualify for an indictment of all of them. I strongly endorse, however, a careful scrutiny of curial behavior, attitude, and procedures. What the report highlights definitely merits honest critique and response, but it is the bureaucratic model which imbues the curia that warrants both revision and vigilant oversight. Let me preface the following remarks by stating that after my 6 years with the Vatican's Congregation for Eastern Churches, I am pleased, yes, delighted, to say that more than 85% of my colleagues were persons of integrity, maturity of character, sincerity, intelligence, and an undiluted love for those entrusted to their care. That some 15% were rather less than admirable in my estimation is a statistic which is low by comparison to other complex institutional systems. But again, it is the bureaucratic model itself which should be examined and reformed. Good and competent people cannot thrive when they are attached to a model which is often self-serving, inefficient, and sterile. The Curia could benefit from basic instruction in organizational management. In what areas specifically? 5 may be cited, and I'm watching the time, Robin. First, my congregation espoused what may be called a hub-and-spoke paradigm. Because of the volume of requests which had to be handled, each staffer was given a particular sector of responsibility. My jurisdiction was that of the St. Thomas Christians, the Syro-Malabar and Syro-Malankara sui juris churches located mainly in India. Even after bi-weekly colloquia of the total congregation, each of us, who were called minutante, knew virtually nothing of our peers' duties and activities. Only the superiori, consisting of the cardinal prefect, the archbishop's secretary, and undersecretary, knew the complete picture of the Eastern churches in communication with the Holy See. And it was the superiori alone who had to approve or veto each minutante's drafts and proposals. The hub, in other words, the superiori, was in full control. The rest of us, the organizational spokes, informally referred to ourselves as the inferiori. Typically, our image was that of a cog in a machine, deprived of any real incorporation in the congregation's superficially conveyed mission. Management theorists such as Mary Coulter have long described the shortcomings of this type of paradigm. Nobody feels that they truly belong. Nobody believes that they are important for the congregation's endeavors. Only the superiori genuinely count, and the rest of us were merely counted. Second, supervision in a Vatican congregation is usually negative. Seldom is a minutante treated with appreciation and affirmation. One is always made aware of what they have done wrong. Never are they told when their performance is exemplary. Ed Fuller, president of Marriott Lodging International, describes leaders as being role models for the truth-telling and fair-minded critiques they expect from their followers. In the curia, disagreement with the superiority means career suicide. Critique is always one-sided, never mutual. Third, my congregation suppressed individualism and thought that if a minutante's professional gifts and expertise were to be acknowledged, this would only arouse jealousy and mistrust. Friendships among minutante were often looked upon with suspicion. When my articles were published monthly in Inside the Vatican, the magazine was removed from the congregation's bookshelves. Only unsigned articles were made available. In such an environment, minutante therefore retreated into silence, afraid to vocalize their feelings and concerns. David S. Hams discusses 13 positives and 13 negative emotions in the measurement of emotional intelligence. I noticed that 10 of the negative emotions were conspicuous in the routine day of my congregation. Fourth, avoidance of conflict adds to the causes of conflict. In a book, the preface to the Directory of the Syro-Malabar Church, there is reference to the curious case of the Southists, known as the Canania. This group is endogamous in that they vigorously oppose intermarriage with Catholics who belong to the other sui juris churches. Canania insists that its members must retain purity of blood lineage. Those who marry outside the Canania circle are treated as tantamount to excommunicate. The Canania position on baptism, marriage, and evangelization is unequivocally opposed to Catholic doctrine, and the pastoral consequences for interritual relationships are a constant source of resentment and controversy. But Canania is allowed to proceed unchecked for their obvious heterodoxy by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. Why? Canonaites are usually affluent and influential. The curia, notably the Eastern Congregation, has adopted a strict avoidance approach to conflict arising from the canonia problem. Rather than confront the proverbial elephant in the living room, avoidance has led to a preference for analysis over action, and there the congregation has become stuck while injustice abounds. Fifth, appeasement. It yields power imbalance, manipulation, and inequity, and it becomes futile. Think of the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, and his euphoric optimism after his return from the 1938 Munich conference. Mistakenly, he wanted to believe that Hitler would refrain from going to war. Probably the issue which most vexes St. Thomas Christians is that the dominant Latin Church deliberately restricts their pastoral movement. This is referred to as the problem of all India jurisdiction. These Eastern Catholics, though theoretically the equal of their Latin counterparts, are in fact subordinated to them. For decades, the Easterns have implored the curia to implore their cause. And for decades, the curia has declined to do so. Why? Despite blatant injustice, it is thought imperative to appease the Latin hierarchy and to erect a facade of congenial coexistence. Relationship with the Latins is a priority for the Eastern congregation, but which is preserved in a manner which is weak and retracting. The novelist Gore Vidal once commented that there is something about a bureaucrat that does not like a poem. He had in mind that bureaucracy can consume a person and rob them of their soul. It can lure them into the temptation to conclude that whatever the organization, it is a worthy end in itself and deserving of maximum allegiance. The Roman Curia, seen through the lens of the 5 aspects of the unconscious model, which I believe to be operative, seeks that its membership be submissive and obedient. The prophetic impulse has become quiet, if not overtly reviled. But this is how the curia seems to express its operational stance. It is not the immutable norm, however, for how the curia must be. Because of the fine caliber of so many of the curial community, that community only awaits to incorporate a new model, one which it cannot deny, one which it cannot dismiss, and one to which it cannot be immune. The papacy of Pope Francis appears determined enough and decisive enough to purge the curia of improper disposition and to recast its model in the image of conversion to Christian discipleship. Pope Francis, a model of service. When he was elected on March 13th, the throngs which assembled to welcome him echoed their conviction that the breath of the Spirit was in the process of touching every crevice and corner of Catholic life. One lady captured the mood of expectancy at the Pope's installation Mass. She said, "I think he will change the Church. He will return it to its humble roots as a ministry to people in need. I love him and what he stands for, she said. In his homily on that occasion, Pope Francis summarized his view on the nature of the papacy. The Pope symbolizes the vocation of each believer to act on behalf of others. Never forget, he stated, that authentic power is service, and that the Pope, too, when exercising power, must enter ever more fully into that service. What can we deduce about how Pope Francis understands such service? His discourse throughout the past month allows us to identify several elements of a pattern for what may actually constitute a model for that service, and they include, first, that service involves us in a journey. Each of us is like the travelers who ventured to Emmaus after the crucifixion of Jesus, spoken about in the 24th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. They knew where they were going, but they lacked the recognition that they were being accompanied by the risen Lord. In truth, they had a very limited comprehension of their own identity. We might say in psychological parlance that the two of them had baggage. They were fixated on their sorrow, their grief, and their loss. They could not grasp that now they had an opportunity to heal their brokenness by adjusting their glance to look carefully at him who walked by their side. The Jerusalem Bible's translation of this New Testament event fittingly describes the intensity of their dilemma and the reality of their human condition. Quote, their eyes were prevented from recognizing him, quote, and they are said to be, quote, talking together, quote. But the Greek text contains more the notion that their words were an exchange with each other. Theirs was not so much a conversation as a vent of words, words which masked their pervasive inner anguish. And as is often found with illness, their bodies conform to their state of mind. When questioned by Jesus, Luke says they stopped, their faces downcast. They had been exposed by him to each other and to themselves. Now their situation could be transformed and their approach to life reformed. In his first greeting after election from the balcony of St. Peter's, Pope Francis spoke to the world and to his Diocese of Rome. We take up this journey. I can only imagine that he was alluding to pilgrimage and probably to an update of Scripture's Emmaus account. As bishop, he journeys with fellow travelers, the people. And collectively, the Church of Rome has embarked upon a journey too. That of, he said, presiding in charity over all the churches. The language synthesizes traditional Catholic teaching, but here the Pope's accent was upon charity, not rulership. The journey of all and the journey of each is the same. Unlike those who were burdened and depressed en route to Emmaus, this journey of the Church, the Pope said, is one in which there is fraternity, love, and trust among us. It is a journey in which we always pray for one another, quote, and for the whole world. Such a prayer exemplifies service. And the Pope says that it is profoundly fecund. It is fruitful for evangelization, quote. And so it was after Emmaus that those who met the Lord in the Eucharistic-like liturgy of the breaking of bread now told their story of what had happened on the road. That story endures. It is the story of abundant generosity and nonviolence. It is the story of willingness to invoke the prayer of the people, asking blessing for their bishop. Second, service is uninhibited to acknowledge gratitude. On March 16th, Pope Francis addressed representatives of the communications media. He did not chastise them or warn them or caution them. Rather, without hesitation, he said to them, "Thank you in a special way for the professional coverage which you provided during these days." For their Pope, their labor was rich in meaning. It contained the gift of themselves. "You really worked, didn't you?" he queried. And he informed them how he had observed that those who presented the events of the conclave and election, events major in church history, did so in a way which was sensitive to the right context in which these events need to be read, quote. And for this the Pope could say, "I am profoundly and particularly grateful." Third, service has no hidden agenda. Because service implies openness and disclosure about its values, its ideals, and its beliefs. There is no avoidance. By contrast, service is able to confront those who gossip, as did those who hurled harsh accusations against the Apostle Matthew when he chose to associate with sinners. So much for being politically correct, and so much for appeasement. We should celebrate unabashedly that our Lord, quote, has a special capacity for forgetting. The Pope says Jesus kisses you, he embraces you, and he never condemns you. This reflection, given in a homily at the Vatican's parish of St. Anna, expresses the Pope's theological view that the Lord never tires of forgiving. Never. It is we who are tired of asking his forgiveness. End of quote. Fourth, service savors the wisdom embodied in the mind and heart of those who are non-influential. In his Angelus message for March 17th, Pope Francis recalled his once having met an elderly woman who told him with conviction that the Lord forgives all things. He asked, "But how do you know, madam?" Her response was a marvel. If the Lord did not forgive everything, the world would not exist. Amazed, the Pope asked her with humor, "Tell me, madam, did you study at the Gregorian University?" In the same Angelus message, the Pope spoke of a book on mercy by Cardinal Casper, and which he said did me a lot of good. Both the clever theologian, as the Pope called him, and the over 80-year-old woman, possibly uneducated formally, gave him remarkable insights, for both were inspired by the same Spirit. Fifth, service realizes that grace is embodied in vulnerability. There is no shame in cultivating tenderness, nor in building sincere friendships, and I'm quoting the Pope again. Like St. Joseph, the Pope stated in his homily for the inauguration of his Petrine ministry, we are protectors. Therefore, this means, again quoting him, keeping watch over our emotions, over our hearts, because they are the seat of good and evil intentions, intentions that build up and tear down. We must not be afraid, he said, of goodness or even tenderness, for these traits are not indicative of weakness. They are a sign of strength, of our capacity for concern, for compassion, for love, quote. And only those who serve with love are able to protect. Sixth, service elicits dialogue. Dialogue which is free from the urge to contrive and induce agreement. Service is content with difference, with what is distinct in religions and in cultures. Attending Pope Francis' massive installation were 31 heads of state, along with delegations from 33 Christian denominations, 16 Jewish delegations, and delegations representing Muslims, Buddhists, and Sikhs. The following day, on March 20th, he met with their representatives. He assured them of his firm intention to pursue the path of ecumenical dialogue. Together we are meant, he said, to counter the dominance of a one-dimension vision of the human person, a vision which reduces human beings to what they produce and what they consume. In the same remarks, Pope Francis paid special attention, quote, to the Jewish people, through whom God's plan of salvation has been so intrinsically linked to the patriarchs, Moses, and the prophets. And he saluted the Muslims, for they worship God as one, living and merciful, and they invoke him in prayer, quote. Seventh and last, Robin. When we serve, we risk. We risk being isolated and rebuffed by common opinion. We risk being misunderstood and rejected, and we risk being shunned. Still, the Pope told confirmandi on April 28th, we must persevere in the courage to swim against the tide, the courage to go against the current. And so we should push forward to the highest principles, staking our lives on noble ideals. His mention of principles and ideals is significant, for ours is a quick-fix era, obsessed with instant gratification. Moreover, we have become addicted to what is utilitarian, and we are forgetting that without principles, we degenerate into the robotic and mechanistic. Principles humanize. They also provide philosophical foundation for our aspirations and action. Otherwise, everything about us becomes random and ad hoc, and we disconnect from the accomplishments of our past and the resources of our present. Analysts have described Pope Francis as a moderate realist. Already he has chosen to eliminate the regal and adopt the familiar. He has dispensed with his limousine and the elegant papal apartments. He laughs, he smiles, and he listens. He also takes incremental steps to refurbish the bark of Peter so that it may carry us and bear us away from the vagaries of fate and toward the joy of our God-filled destiny. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
You can't stand up. No, you can't stand. I hope you're not asking for an encore, in which case... No, I'd like, first of all, if you'd like to sit down for a moment, we can stand up and thank Bernie in a minute, but thank you for that wonderful accolade. What I've got to do is thank him on your behalf and also encourage you, I think, to engage, as you so articulately said, in an exchange of words. But I'd like to thank you, first of all, for three things. For putting Pope Benedict into a wonderful perspective, courageous, someone who has done an immense amount of structural change for the Church, which has gone unnoticed, especially after rather an unpleasant beginning where he was very misquoted in the media. Secondly, the resignation of a Pope, which I think for the religious world in general gives a new flavour of what is going on within the Catholic community itself. Then into, I think, the curia, which I also have dealings with because as member of the Eastern Church, connected with your congregation, I know full well that it's what you call festina lente is the Latin mode. Everything is made haste but very slowly. So we're hoping that under Pope Francis things kick-start a bit better. And thirdly, for your impressions but also hope, I think, wonderful hope in a very synthetic manner of what Pope Francis means. Just to share a thought, I was thinking as you were saying, what's in a name? The choice of Francis is no accident, and I think of that Francis of Assisi, loved by so many ecumenically, but particularly, and this is what we forget, by the Islamic community, because Francis was loved by Saladin, and we forget that he, that humble little man, in front of the Sultan, in that area of the world where he went to preach, was respected for his simplicity and love. And so, in a sense, what you said about the way Pope Francis has spoken about the Jewish community, about the Islamic community, about Buddhist community, and also, let's not forget, those who don't believe, because he opened his arms to them and said, let's say a prayer, but in quietness, I think we have a prophetic witness of a community of faith coming together a little more in what you would say is his understanding of familiarity, gentleness and love. So I'd like to thank you for those insights and also for bringing it into the ambience of our Graduate Theological Foundation, because that's, in a sense, what we're about. So thank you for a wonderful Runcie lecture, for the knowledge you've given, for the humour, and I noted you were watching my curial eye, keeping an eye on our watch. And please go out now to engage with Bernie and discuss with him, exchange words. And as you go out, there's a free gift. There's several little books. Please take them from the Foundation, including one in which you will find some of the dialogue about the Vatican and its exchange. So, welcome again. Please go out, and thank you again, Dr. O'Connor, Father Bernie, for everything you've done. So if you'd like to stand.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Robin.
My pleasure. Come. No, it was brilliant.